Every year, MLB Trade Rumors releases their projected salaries for each arbitration-eligible player on every team. On today's show, going to discuss the 16 Mets set to hit arbitration, which ones will stay, which ones will go. You'll have it all for today's episode of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Locked On Mets is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Now on today's show, we're going to go through the arbitration-eligible players for the Mets this offseason. In the first segment, going to talk about MLB Trade Rumors projected salaries for all these players and the locks who will definitely be tendered a contract by the Mets this offseason. In the second segment, I want to talk about a few players who are on the bubble. Trevor Williams, Robert Gsellman, and Miguel Castro, where I could see it going either way. The Mets may tender them a contract, or they may just let them go and look for other replacements in free agency. In the final segment, I will talk about the three players that I believe are definite non-tenders, and that's Jose Peraza, Jose Martinez, and Joey Lucchesi. Before we get to any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing about the Mets at justbaseball.com. So every year, MLB Trade Rumors releases this projection for arbitration salaries. Now, this is based on an algorithm from Matt Schwartz, which is a way to identify what these players will be making based on other contracts around the league, which is very similar to what the teams are doing, what the players' agents are doing at this stage as they're trying to come up with salaries for the upcoming season for players who are under team control but not under contract. And that is what arbitration is. For those of you who aren't aware what the arbitration process is, or if you've heard of it but have never really understood it, it's pretty simple. If a player has at least 3 years of service time, they become arbitration eligible. Now, you have some players who can be Super 2 arbitration eligible players where they have over 2 years of service time and they meet in certain criteria, like J.D. Davis and Dominic Smith. They are both arbitration Super 2 players. Regardless, what that means is there is a point in every offseason where teams have to exchange numbers with players. And this is before that, they can still meet with their players, exchange numbers, come to terms on contracts. And generally, a week before the deadline in mid-January is when you see all of these things ironed out where, the Mets will announce that Pete Alonso is going to make $7.2 million next year, or Seth Lugo is going to make 3.5, whatever it is. That is a way to avoid arbitration. That could be under a single-year contract or a multi-year deal that would buy out all the arbitration seasons. So that is generally what happens here. If the two teams cannot come to terms on a contract by that deadline in mid-January, then an arbitration hearing is set. The two teams can still talk. They can still come to terms outside of court on a new deal, but there are a lot of teams now that go by a file and trial type of format where if they can't come to terms by that deadline, they're going to go to arbitration. And then at arbitration, the players and the team will meet in front of a third-party court. An arbitration hearing will take place, and that third party will decide which salary is going to be the one that a player will have going into the next season, whether it's what the player believes they're worth or what the team believes they're worth. And at times, these can get contentious, and that's why teams generally try to avoid going into arbitration hearings. With all that said, that's your general breakdown of what arbitration is. Here is MLB Trade Rumors projected salaries for the 16 Mets that are heading towards arbitration or that are in arbitration this upcoming season. You have Edwin Diaz at $10.4 million. That's the most of any player on the Mets. You got Pete Alonso at 7.3. You have Brandon Nimmo at $6 million. Going down the line, you got Dominic Smith at 4. J.D. Davis at 2.7. Jeff McNeil at 2.8. You have Seth Lugo at 3.7. And then you have Tomas Nido at $900,000. Louis Guillorme at $700,000. You have Jose Peraza at $1 million, Miguel Castro at 2.6, Robert Gsellman at 1.6, Trevor Williams at 3.8, Jose Martinez at $1 million, Joey Lucchesi at 1.6, and then Drew Smith at 900,000. Now, these are just projections, right? That's not what these guys are definitely going to make. They might think they're worth more. The team might think they're worth less. They're going to talk, and a lot of these things will just get ironed out. When it comes to all these players, there's obvious locks here where they're going to be tendered a contract one way or another, whether it's going to an arbitration hearing or agreeing before the deadline. You have Pete Alonso, Jeff McNeil, Brandon Nimmo, Edwin Diaz, Seth Lugo. They're all locks to be tendered a contract, and I believe they're all locks to remain with the Mets this offseason. Maybe you could see some type of a trade for a Jeff McNeil. I don't foresee that. Seth Lugo and Edwin Diaz fall into that class as well, where you could potentially see a perfect scenario where a trade would help both teams that are trying to win, that maybe something would get done. But I imagine all those guys I just mentioned are going to be part of the 2022 Mets. Now, from there, you look at some of the locks to go through arbitration and be tendered a contract, but not necessarily locks to remain with the Mets. Dominic Smith and JD Davis are the most obvious. They have been on the trade block over the last couple of years. That's not going to change this offseason. After a down year, the Mets may be looking to shake things up, and those guys could certainly be traded. So they are likely to be tendered a contract. They're going to go through this arbitration process, but they also could be moved. And the other thing is, if the Mets wanted to get really crazy, they could save that money. I mean, like I said, Dom projected to be at $4 million, JD at 2.7. They really wanted to save money. They could non-tender them, but that would be shocking because both of these guys figure to have value to the Mets, whether it's on the team next year or in the trade market. Then you have Louis Guillorme, Tomas Nido, and Drew Smith, who are all near locks to be tendered a contract. For Nido, great defensive catcher. He makes a lot of sense moving forward. Him and James McCann, both under control for 3 more years. For Nido, obviously, that's through arbitration. For McCann, with that big contract, they're your bridge right now to Francisco Alvarez. So maybe next offseason, if Alvarez is about ready to break through and James McCann still has that hefty contract, maybe that would be a time where the Mets would potentially non-tender Nido if he had a bad year. But considering how great he was defensively, considering some of the flashes he continues to show each year offensively, he makes too much sense to non-tender when he might not even be making $1 million next year. So that would be an obvious lock. You look at Louis Guillorme, fills too many needs. He's too cheap, 2 minor league options. I don't see why you non-tender him. And Drew Smith, same thing. Looked great at a lot of different points this year. Cheap, still has a minor league option. I don't know why you would non-tender a pitcher like that who is under plenty of control. Still have him for 3 more seasons. And I forgot to mention, you have Guillorme for 4 more seasons. So with all that said, those are your locks. But that brings us to some of the players that could potentially be non-tendered this offseason and not be allowed to go through that arbitration process. And the 3 I want to talk about next are the ones that I would be sitting on the fence for, and the Mets probably will as well. Robert Gsellman, Miguel Castro, and Trevor Williams. One reason to repair and maintain your cars is to save money. So why would you choose to spend 30%, 50%, maybe even 100% more for the exact same auto parts at a chain store or new car dealership when you could just go to rockauto.com, a family business that's been serving auto parts to customers online for 20 years. They have everything you could want, from engine control modules to brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Whether it's for your classic or daily driver, get everything you need in a few easy clicks and have it delivered directly to your door. The rockauto.com catalog is unique and remarkably easy to navigate. Quickly see all the parts available for your vehicle, then choose the brand specifications and prices you prefer. Go to rockauto.com right now, see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right locked on in there, how'd you hear about us box, so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. All right, so let's go through these 3 pitchers that I could see non-tendered a contract, but I could also see the Mets seeing merits in bringing any of them back. And the one that's the most obvious to return to the Mets next year is Miguel Castro, because on the surface, numbers are pretty good. 3.45 ERA, which was actually the best mark of his career. 77 strikeouts in 70 1/3 innings pitched. He was good, and he took the ball 69 different times, which is nice, of course. He was out there and he was one of the most used relievers in the Mets bullpen, a guy that can eat innings for you and at times pitch in high leverage situations. The one concern that I would have with Miguel Castro is I don't know if he's ever going to live up to the promise of being a seventh or an eighth inning reliever. And we saw a stretch of that at the beginning of the season where it was like, wow, Miguel Castro, that high octane stuff, it's coming together. It looks great. He's striking out a ton of guys. And then Major League Baseball cut down on the use of sticky substances. I'm not saying that's definitely what happened here, but we did see some stark splits pre and post that decision. And for Miguel Castro, if you look at his stats in April and May, he had a 1.64 ERA with 17 strikeouts and 11 innings pitched. From that point on, nowhere near as dominant with the strikeouts or the ERA. He had a 3.79 ERA from that point on after May. So, with that said, it's still valuable, but maybe not an expectation that he's going to be a high leverage guy for you, which is fine. He can be the fifth guy in your bullpen and bring great value and value that's worthy of a $2.6 million contract, which is what is projected by MLB Trade Rumors. It's just up to the Mets to decide if that's worth it for a guy that's in his last year of control, or if they like to use that money to maybe take a flyer on a different free agent reliever or somebody else entirely. So that's still on the table. The Mets have to make that decision. I look at Castro like a Hansel Robles, and we are seeing Robles now pitch for the Red Sox, still serving up 96 down the middle for some home runs. These are guys that will give you that mirage of being the elite closer because they can, or not even a closer, the elite high leverage pitcher because they can go out in one inning and strike at the side and hit 100 and look lights out. But then their control can be a problem at times. They'll walk guys or they'll leave pitches down the heart of the plate, give up home runs, and run into some trouble. So it is a tough decision for the Mets on Miguel Castro. I would imagine they will keep him because there is still some value to be extracted there. But I would also not be stunned if they decided to non-tender him and go in another direction. They could also do that with Robert Gsellman, who has now reached his final year of arbitration. Feels like he's been on the Mets forever. This year, not a bad season when it comes to his performance on the field, but he was hurt once again. That has been a problem for Gsellman as of late. 3.77 ERA and 28 and 2/3 innings pitched, only 17 strikeouts, which is a little bit concerning. That strikeout per nine, which for his career sits just over 7, has been under 6 the last 2 years. Now, these are small sample sizes in 2020 and 2021, but he hasn't He hasn't demonstrated that high strikeout stuff that we saw in 2019, where that strikeout per nine got close to 9. It was over 8. So, what are you going to get next season? Is his value of being able to eat up multiple innings worthy of tendering him a contract at what's projected at, was it 1.6? Yeah, $1.6 million. It's a tough call. And because 40-man roster spots are at a premium, I could see the Mets saying, you know what, Robert, go out in free agency and get yourself a shot with another team that might be able to use you a little bit more. And for Gsellman, it might be a good thing for him to get non-tendered because maybe Gsellman can sign with the Pirates or can sign with the Orioles or some team like that, and he might even get a chance to start. And maybe Robert Gsellman can pitch well enough that he could earn himself a contract going into free agency the following year. So that's another thing to talk about. Maybe Gsellman's representation asked the Mets to let him go. It wouldn't be completely unheard of. Those are conversations that happen behind the scenes. And so maybe that's something that happens here with Gsellman. It could be the best thing for his career. I could see him getting non-tendered for sure. But I could also see the Mets saying, you know what? There's more value in bringing him back than bringing back Trevor Williams because he's going to make a lot less money. Whereas Trevor Williams, because of his salary going into this year and everything else, he's projected to make, is it $4 million? 3.8. So nearly 4. So $3.8 million is the projection for Trevor Williams. And Trevor Williams was very good for the Mets after the trade deadline. Came in as the other piece of the Javi Baez trade, pitched to a 3.06 ERA with 29 strikeouts and 32 and a third innings pitched. His strikeout per nine for his career is nearly identical to Robert Gsellman's, but the difference is Williams has been adding strikeouts year over year. So that tells me that his stuff is getting sharper. He's learning how to pitch more and more, and he certainly has more starting experience than Gsellman, where he gives you that depth to be a seventh starter going into a season where he can be the swing man and you can have him out of the bullpen and play that role that he played down the stretch, but he could also slide into the rotation if there's injuries. So I really like Trevor Williams after watching him pitch, but because he's going to make nearly $4 million, and that is certainly a sizable amount of money that could be used elsewhere, that could lead the Mets to ultimately decide that it's just not worth the squeeze to bring him back for one final year and let him go his separate ways as well. And again, for a guy like Williams, that could be the best thing for him as well, as he is eyeing free agency the following season. Or again, if he's non-tendered, he'll have free agency to try to get a deal and try to pitch up to a level where he is able to secure a bigger bag the following offseason. So those are the three pitchers that can really go either way. I would not blame the Mets for non-tendering any of them or signing all of them. I mean, it's a tough decision. You really have to weigh the 40-man roster crunch. It's always hard to fully understand what an organization is thinking until we have the full picture, but you've got to imagine there's going to be other free agents coming in, taking 40-man spots. You got to think about some of your prospects you want to protect from the Rule 5 draft. And all three of those guys could certainly be replaced with minor league pitching depth that the Mets have some of in those upper levels. Guys that we've talked about on Friday Farm Reports, like Cole Gordon and Adam Oller. If those guys are good enough where you have faith that they can contribute at the big league level the next year, it allows you to cut ties with these guys that are near the end of their arbitration track who are just not producing much better than 4A players. And for Castro, that's not necessarily fair. For the other two, it certainly has some ring of truth to it. But that is the three that are on the bubble. We got three more guys to discuss: Joey Lucchesi, Jose Peraza, and Jose Martinez, who I believe will be non-tender, and I'll talk about why in just a minute. All eyes are on the gridiron as teams are back for another football season. And as always, BetOnline is your number one spot for all the pro and college football action this season. With a new updated site and interface, there's now even more odds, props, and contests available at betonline.ag, which continues to be your number one source for everything football. Head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today and receive your 100% welcome bonus. That's double your initial deposit just for signing up. Don't forget to use the promo code NFL100 to get that special offer. From football, basketball, boxing, baseball, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. All right, so let's now get into the three players that I believe will be non-tendered this offseason for sure. And we'll start with Joe Lucchesi. No fault to him, but he underwent Tommy John surgery this past year. Are you going to keep a 40-man spot devoted to somebody who's not going to pitch in 2022? That's the question you have to weigh right now. And at $1.6 million, it's another thing that you think about. Is it worth it to pay him $1.6 million to basically rehab all year just so that you get his final couple years of control? That is what Steve Cohen and company have to weigh right now. It depends on what you think about his prospects coming off the Tommy John. This was a guy that the Mets did value when they identified him and traded for him as rotation depth under control. And he had a rough start to the season, but really started to find something right before he got hurt. When he comes back, going to have to deal with those growing pains of adjusting after you replace that UCL. Guys certainly are able to bounce back from Tommy John. Sometimes they can even be better, but it does take time. I don't expect him to contribute at all next year, but you would have him under control for 2023 and 2024. 2 seasons where you would have a pitcher making, I would imagine, still less than $3 million. I mean, right now he's projected to make 1.6. He doesn't pitch at all next year. That's going to be the same salary heading into the following season. So he's a cost-controlled starter, and you could put a premium on that. Once you get to the season, he can just be on the IL. He's not going to take up a 40 spot. But right now, when you're trying to decide what to do in the offseason, it could just make more sense to cut ties. And you can always find other rotation depth like Lucchesi, whether it's guys that get non-tender for other teams or as a throw-in in a trade like you just got Trevor Williams in the Javi Baez trade. So I think because of that, Lucchesi likely just let go this offseason and non-tendered. You then have Jose Peraza and Jose Martinez. For Martinez, we never saw him in a Mets uniform. He ended up tearing his meniscus in spring training, was out for a long time, did eventually end up in Syracuse, played 12 games there. Overall, hit pretty well, but it was out of sight, out of mind. There was really no ties to him in this current club. Now you have to decide for $1 million if it's worth bringing him back. The thing about Martinez and Peraza is these guys were minor league signings last offseason for a reason, because they were previously non-tender from other clubs, and they're the type of players that are going to probably be in that limbo unless they have a real breakout season where they get playing time and they show what they can do. And for Martinez, the bat certainly plays where you could see him latch on to a team where he can DH and he can play a little first base. And who knows, maybe the guy hits 30 bombs and shows that he can be the player he was at times in St. Louis. But he hasn't been that. And I don't think they're guaranteeing him a major league contract right now after not playing all season. So because of that, I see the Mets non-tendering him. Not to mention, he is another square peg in a round hole player, as I've described Dominic Smith and JD Davis in the past. So you have another guy who can't play defense, who has a bat that should hit against left-handed pitching, but hasn't been consistent enough offensively to swallow the poor defense. So I just think it's another roster spot that can be used on a different player. And you could probably find another player like Jose Martinez or even Martinez himself later on in the offseason on a minor league deal. So why tender him a major league contract now? Same goes with Peraza, although Peraza certainly endeared himself a bit to Mets fans, was one of the replaced Mets when the Mets were playing their best baseball in May. He played absolutely outstanding defense at second base, worth 7 outs above average and limited playing time. That is hard to do. He is special defensively. He gives you a backup shortstop, can play third. He's a gamer as well. He had 6 home runs, had out some clutch hits. I like Peraza a lot. But when you have Luis Guillorme, and again, 40-man roster spots are at a premium, there's just not necessarily room to tender Peraza a contract now. That's another guy that I would want to revisit later on in the offseason on a minor league deal if he can't find a major league contract. But you're talking about a guy that still hit 204, 266 on base percentage, slugging percentage of 380, doesn't have enough power, even though the 6 home runs were a surprise, doesn't hit for a high enough average, and doesn't get on base enough. Great glove, but again, you have Guillorme. There's just not a need for 2 of them on the 40-man roster as you make your big decisions throughout the offseason. Minor league contract player, absolutely. We'll see what happens there. But overall, that is basically what you're looking at with the Mets. There is a chance that they non-tender up to 6 players, if not more. Maybe they are very aggressive non-tendering guys and clearing up spots for impending free agents if they're really trying to shake up the roster. And they're going to even go as far as to wave goodbye to a Nito or a Guillorme or a Drew Smith. But like I said, if you want to know the locks, in my opinion, the locks to get tendered a contract this offseason, it's Pete Alonso, Jeff McNeil, Brandon Nimmo, Edwin Diaz, Seth Lugo, Dominic Smith, JD Davis, Luis Guillorme, Tomas Nido, and Drew Smith. Those are your 10 locks out of 16. Then you have some real questions to be asked about Castro, Gazelman, and Trevor Williams. And then I imagine Martinez, Peraza, and Lucchesi are all let go. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's edition of Locked On Mets. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter, at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show, at Locked On Mets. On tomorrow's show, going to continue the top 10 most disappointing aspects of the 2021 season with number 5, James McCann, and his rough first year in Queens. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out the Locked On MLB podcast with Paul Francis Sullivan. Call him Sully. He's got you covered for everything going on in the MLB playoffs this October.